Today I want to talk to you about something that I don't like that it is kinda true. Authorities. Authorities is something that I don't like that we recognize so much, and I also don't like that we obey to them so much. Still, today's video is exactly about the fact that we obey authorities, sometimes against our own will, sometimes against our own values. More about that in a moment. But obviously, before we begin, I have to tell you that this is Yury Experience, and here I share my various experiences and various knowledge about different topics. I do 2 videos per week, Mondays and Thursdays. If you will enjoy this video, please drop a like. You can also subscribe to the channel. Let's go! The main topic of today's video are Milgram experiments, and here is a description of these experiments, which are currently not considered humane, but still are very interesting in terms of human psychology. In the late 20th century, a scientist with last name Milgram, actually that's his full name, that scientist wanted to understand how people during Nazi times in Germany lived. Why did they participate in all the acts of violence and all of acts of destruction that happened during that time? So he created and conducted an experiment that he actually planned to do in Germany later, because he thought that mentality in Germany is more fitting for this kind of obedience. But, and it is a small spoiler alert, he didn't have to go to Germany. During the experiment, there are 3 people in the room or in the rooms: experimenter, teacher and learner. Experimenter and learner are people who are not real participants of the experiment. They are kinda actors. The teacher one is the only person in this experiment who is like a real participant, who doesn't know what's actually going on. The teacher person thinks that they participate in an experiment where people try to understand whether pain can help you with learning. For that purpose, the learner person is seated in something like an electric chair, and the teacher person has a control over electricity of the chair. And basically the experimenter person is just an observer of teacher conducting like this learning session with a learner. The learning experience is pretty simple. The learner has to remember words and like basically their pairs that are assigned to them. And the teacher says a word and says 4 possible answers, and learner answers based on these answers. For each right answer, nothing happens, but for each wrong answer, teacher pushes the button and the learner gets electrocuted with the voltage that was set at that moment. Each wrong answer increases the voltage by 15 volts if I'm not mistaken, and we are starting relatively low by something like 30 volts and we end with like 450 volts, which is not really deadly, it's like completely deadly. It annihilates person's existence. The things that are important to know. The learner, first thing, the learner isn't getting electrocuted. That's not what this experiment is actually about. The teacher thinks that learner is electrocuted. In all variations of this experiment, teacher doesn't have like direct contact or direct like understanding of what is happening with the learner. Like there's an actor in a different room that is hitting the wall, so maybe shouting and asking for help, because after 300 volts people usually like die on a lot of occasions. It is a huge voltage. Like in this thing, whatever it's called, it is 120 volt in US and 240 volt in like Europe, and you shall not touch it with your bare fingers. And it is 300 volt. 300 volt is higher. The thing number 2, experimenter says the teacher that learner is safe. There is no actual damage that will happen to learner. It is not bad what is going on right now. But on the other hand, on the scale of the voltages, it is written down that it is like safe, dangerous, very dangerous, hazard, that person will probably die. And the third thing, if the person hesitates to do something, the experimenter will say like 4 phrases, and they have to come in some specific sequence, and only if the previous sentence didn't work. And the first sentence is something like, please do it again, and the last sentence is, you have to do it. So it's like a little responsibility to like, you have to do it, because otherwise the experiment will fail or whatnot. Prior to conducting the actual experiment, Mr. Milgram asked a lot of other people, students and his colleagues, about their expectations in terms of the experiment. And most of them told him that people will not go above 300 volt, like maybe 1–2% of people, but most of them will not. Most people will stop pretty early and will not continue with an experiment. And there were a lot of people whom he asked, a lot of people who kinda shall know how our psychology works, because some of these people were popular like scientific people in terms of psychology. But expectation is one thing and reality is a different thing. If I remember correctly, in the first experiment or set of experiments, something like 60% of people went to the maximum voltage of 450 volt. And all of the people went above 300 volt, starting from which point the learner, the person who was like trying to learn stuff, started hitting the walls and doors and shouting for help. All of them showed clear signs of feeling uncomfortable, sweating and whatnot. They didn't feel good about what they are doing, but they still did it. They still followed the authorities' like words and encouragement and actually try to electrocute a person that they don't know, that is just sitting in the room behind the wall. The first experiment was done in USA, and after that there were a hell lot of experiments all over the world with different groups of people, different gender, different scientists, all whatnot, and most of them showed pretty much same results. So basically, if there is one clear authority, like there is not many people, not many experimenter people, but if there is one clear authority, and if there is little to no direct interaction with a person in pain, then most of us, or like around 60% normally, will just follow the words of the authority. Or I shall rephrase, around 60% of people during the experiments follow the words of the authority. And when I'm talking about no direct contact, there were also different kinds of experiments. And for example, in one kind of experiment, person was in a different room. In a different kind, the person was in the same room. In the other kind, the person actually had a direct contact to a teacher. So teacher actually like pushed a hand towards the current. So at least teacher thought that the teacher did it. And depending on how direct the interaction was, the probability of that person actually following the words of the authority was lower. And it is kinda understandable. If you can feel a person like pushing that person's hand towards like electricity and feeling basically that person's pain and struggle, there's a higher probability that your consciousness will think for a second, what the hell am I doing here? Let's discuss it. There are a lot of thoughts of different specialists, but the main target of this experiment, which was to look whether a person's own values and authorities' words, who will win if these two things will fight, the target was kind of achieved, and it was achieved not in a form that people expected. Most of us think that we have strong values, and these experiments showed us, or showed at least Mr. Milgram and a lot of scientists, we don't. We have some values, but these values can go away pretty quickly if we have like some form of authority. Obviously, this experiment or like the setting of this experiment doesn't work all the time. It was specific setting, there were a lot of ifs during the experiment, and although some of these ifs were covered, most of them were not, and in the real world we will have some different development of the situation. Except for that, since the first approach of this experiment was to understand the people during Nazi times, a lot of people criticized this approach in order to understand the psychology of Nazi people. It was said something like, we can try to understand psychology of some people with the help of this experiment, especially people who did some administrative job, who basically wrote down that these people shall be killed, but they didn't actually kill people, they just wrote it down, and for them it was similarly to throwing away a bag of potatoes. But it definitely doesn't explain how people actually killed people, how people held guns to some people's heads and actually like killed them. The interesting point here would be, why do we follow authorities? Why do we do it although it goes against our own values? And here there are a couple of ideas. The one that I like the most and that I can understand the most is that we just give away the responsibility. At that moment where there is an authority in the room or in surroundings, and that authority tells us to do something and we trust that authority, we give away responsibility for our actions to that authority. We say we didn't think about it. We say we follow the orders. And as I found out today, this whole idea of I just followed an order is used in cards sometimes. During Nazi times it was like semi-useful. Some people got less punishment because of the fact that they just followed the orders. But overall, there is this idea that people follow the authorities, and sometimes it's technically what the thing is about. If we are thinking about army, the whole point of army that people follow orders. People don't really think much, people just do what they are said. And basically they are following the ideas of the authority, although these ideas can go against their own values. Still, in my personal opinion, these experiments are extremely interesting. They are not allowed to do anymore. We are not allowed to do this kind of experiments anymore. It is prohibited by law. But on the other hand, a hell lot of experiments in the past were not really humane, but we still use the results of these experiments nowadays. So I don't want to talk to you about methods of this experiment, but I don't want to tell you that the results are something to think about, in my personal opinion. The results is something that shall bring you to this idea. People think differently, and sometimes people don't really think. It is a creative thought, but a lot of stuff that happens in our life people do without thinking. They do it just because they follow orders, just because they follow the ideas of the authorities, and it is something that you would probably do too. That's kind of the main interesting point. Although only 60% of people, around 60% of people of the participants actually did something that went against their values. We are not considering different psychological constructs that exist in the world, like propaganda, like group measures, like group following, group ideas. There are religions, there are a hell lot of psychological ideas that can bring us to act differently. This one is just really in your face. That's why I do like this experiment so much. It is literally in your face. Nobody expected it, and it happened. It happened crazy. And the point that it doesn't matter what country we are talking about, what level, what status, what income, what gender, what sex, it doesn't matter, because there were done experiments with different groups. And most of them showed pretty much similar results. Which is why it's something to know. It's not a reason to excuse such a behavior. I don't think so. I personally don't think so. I think it is a reason why this behavior exists. People sometimes act not with their own consciousness, but with decisions of other people. It is not a right thing to do. I would completely agree with you on that. But it is something that we have in our psyche, and it is not something that we can just throw away. It is a reason, not an excuse, but a reason. That's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If it is the case, please drop a like. You can also subscribe to the channel. You can also leave a comment. And I see you in 1.5 weeks. I take a short break and I see you afterwards. Bye!